Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I'm joined by Emily Arsenault, a fellow Connecticut native who now makes her home in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts. I first met Emily in 2011 when her second novel, In Search of the Rose Notes, was published. I liked that book so much that I haven't missed one since. Emily and I have had several occasions to meet in subsequent years, and I've even had the pleasure of moderating her in conversation and profiling her for Mystery Scene magazine. To date, Emily has published 8 novels, 6 for adults and 2 YA. Her debut, The Broken Tea Glass, was named a New York Times Notable Crime Book of 2009, and In Search of the Rose Notes and The Evening Spider both received starred reviews from Publishers Weekly. Emily's newest release, All the Pretty Things, is her second young adult title. The story plays out against Fabuland, where 17-year-old Ivy Cork learns the dark truths that lie behind the fun-looking facade of her father's amusement park and the suspicious death of a friend. School Library Journal said, "This is more than a thriller filled with mystery and intrigue. It also speaks to the complexity and internalized struggle of guilt, loss, and loving someone you can't trust." Emily's books have been categorized as everything from quirky fiction to literary mysteries, but perhaps their unifying theme is this: the secrets people keep and the destruction that comes with the threat of exposure. But I'll let Emily tell you about that. After all, the best secrets are the ones that come straight from the keeper. Hi, everybody. I am introducing you to Emily Arsenault today, and she's going to tell us a bit about her new young adult novel, All the Pretty Things, which has a really cool cover, but maybe we'll come back to that a bit later. But I first wanted to start by asking you, Emily, if you could tell us a little bit about the importance of books in your childhood and how your reading life sort of led you to your writing life.
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me on your new
Of course.
show.
Thanks for doing this.
I started to be a pretty voracious reader at maybe age 10 or 11 or so. And, I'd love to say I loved all the award-winning books, like Newbery Award-winning books and stuff. But actually, I kind of liked the stuff that my teachers probably would have considered a little trashier. I'm not going to say what the stuff was, because wouldn't want to characterize any books as trashy, but I loved books that promised that there would be a secret in them. Like if I was in the bookstore and I read the back of a book and it said somebody had a secret, like on the back of the book, I had to buy the book and read it immediately, like on the way home, to figure out what the secret was. I just, as a 10 or 11-year-old, I think there's something about that age. I was just obsessed with secrets, and maybe because I didn't have any good secrets at that age, just to find them in books was really exciting. And I think that actually translates to my books now. The kind of books I write is usually people who have some kind of a secret. It could be a real juicy secret, or it could just be something emotionally that eats at them and is revealed at some point in the book. But I feel like there's a direct correlation between the kind of stuff I was attracted to as a kid and the kind of stuff I write now. It kind of comes from the same place of
Sure.
just being about that, finding that juicy secret and the satisfaction of that. So,
I can really appreciate that. I think I was like the same type of child. And I remember really vividly when I was in elementary school, like at the end of the year, they did the big slideshow to congratulate you on successfully completing grade 3 or whatever it was and moving on to middle school. And they had to put a picture in of everybody. And it was all these people like together and things. And I'm sure it was me alone reading a book in the parking lot. And that's still what I tend to do. So old habits die hard.
Right. I mean, speaking also to that, like I found writing soon after that. I was a really quiet kid, and I started writing right around the same age, maybe age 11, and I found it was exciting to be able to find your voice in that. And I found I got teachers' attention that way by writing a really good story rather than raising my hand in class or something like that. So that was also a big part of it.
I was going to say, you weren't the one who, raised a disturbance, huh? That wasn't you. You were not that child.
No, I kind of wish
Quiet
it was.
child with a book. Who could write? So we were talking a little bit before we started recording about how these are, strange days and strange times, and we're all just trying to adjust. And so, we found our technology, such as Zoom, but you had a book come out sort of right before everything blew up, and we all sort of went on lockdown. So can you talk a little bit about the challenges that come with, trying to promote a book when you can't really leave your house, but also either the bookstores or specific booksellers that you have found to be champions of you in their books, and how they've been able to embrace innovation?
Sure. I mean, my book came out March 17th, and that was a week everything was shutting down. And I have to say, book promotion was not a high priority for me. I had some events and school visits that were canceled, but in that moment, it really didn't feel significant that
Sure.
just my events were canceled. So I have to say, it's a challenge even to maybe for some authors. I don't know how it is for others, but it was for me to kind of even bring yourself to that as a priority. I did a couple of posts, but I even felt a little strange about that. But I will say, some bookstores have been really helpful to me in they're doing a little bit for me, so I don't have to always be tooting my own horn. Some independent bookstores in my area. I wanted to name particularly Federal Street Books in Greenfield, and Boswell's Books in Shelburne Falls. These are all very small bookstores that are delivering books to people, taking phone calls, emails, and also promoting books online. Kind of stepping up to the task of doing deliveries for people who need to. And even if you're not near those bookstores, like your independent bookstore, you may be surprised what they're doing to get books to people. So you should give them a call if you're wondering about that. And I did also want to mention Book Club on the Go in South Windsor, Connecticut. She's delivering all over parts of northern Connecticut. Her name is Cindy. And she's been really great. Right in the midst of kind of one of the worst weeks of the pandemic, and as stuff was happening really fast, she was posting a couple of pictures of her delivering books with her dog, and my book was among them. And that was just really great for me to see. It was just a really lighthearted moment that helped me out. And it was just inspiring that she's still bringing books to her people. So
Yeah, she's a rock star. I love it. It's,
yeah.
what is it? Curbside, or no, it's delivery to your house, but contactless. And
Mhm.
I was emailing her saying, it's a really good thing we don't live closer, because you would be at my house like every other day. But it's wonderful what she's able to do. And just to, piggyback on what you were saying, the independent bookstore spirit has been amazing. And there are so many options that people don't realize. You can pick up curbside at a lot of places. They'll mail books directly to you. You
Mhm.
can call or email, and a lot of times they'll even, cultivate like a special book package if you tell them what your interests are. So it's
Right.
really fabulous, again, to see the independent bookstores really stepping up and getting creative. And on the flip side of that, seeing the community really coming out and supporting them in innovative ways too, which is really, really nice. And it keeps our local independent bookstores going, because that's very, very important. And I think we appreciate books even more at a time like this, where we're all sort of starved for entertainment and ways to amuse ourselves. So yay, indies. So to circle back to your new book, All the Pretty Things, I wanted
Mhm.
to ask you how sort of psychology podcasts, and particularly ones about narcissistic personality disorder, how that sort of sparked your inspiration for this particular story.
Yeah, it's kind of strange. My previous book that I was writing, it starts with there's a therapist who's found dead in his office. It's called The Last Thing I Told You. When I was working on that, I really was doing a lot of research on therapy and different styles of therapy, and competent versus incompetent therapists. And I stumbled across a few podcasts. I can't really afford therapy, quite honestly, but so I couldn't do that as research. But there are a few really good podcasts about the therapy process, and different ones where people call in, or there are different guest stars, and not stars but guests. And one thing a pattern I noticed, was that a lot of people who are in therapy or seeking therapy or like to discuss their therapy, is that they talk a lot about how they've had a narcissistic parent. and how that affected them growing up. And this was something that I hadn't really given a lot of thought to. I don't feel I have narcissistic parents at all, but I thought, that really must be difficult to grow up in that situation where you're always kind of serving somebody else's self-image. So I started doing a lot of research on that. And to be perfectly honest, one of my big inspirations was watching Ivanka Trump in action, just wondering what her life is like, or what it was like growing up. To have, to kind of live part of your life in service to this parental figure who perhaps gives you a lot, but also takes a lot from you. So that was my initial inspiration for All the Pretty Things, was just exploring what that must be like. And then I created this setting of two things. I decided the father of my teenage character, whose name is Ivy, her father would be he owns like a donut empire, which he's pretty good at, but then he also purchases an amusement park as well. So he's these two things he's dealing with, and perhaps having those two businesses takes too much out of him, that it also takes a toll on his children. So Ivy works for the amusement park, where a lot of her friends work as well. And then I decided, there has to be a mystery in the story. Somebody is found dead. In fact, Ivy's best friend finds the body. So her best friend is in bad shape psychologically at the beginning of the book. And Ivy just has her suspicions about what that was all about. The police came to a certain conclusion, but she thinks there's more to it. So she just starts exploring what people have to say about the night this person disappeared, and she finds some inconsistencies. But as much as it's a mystery, it's also just an exploration of her kind of coming to terms with who her father is, with, I think, in the beginning of the book.
Sure, yeah, I was going to say,
she tolerates him, but I don't think she has a full sense of his true limitations. So that's kind of what the book is about, is her awakening to that. So
yeah, it's interesting because it's sort of, you have an external mystery, but the more questions she begins to ask, the more internal it becomes, because then she has to sort of start asking questions, about her own history and the people that she knows or thinks that she knows. So you sort of have a mystery working on both levels, which I thought was really interesting. And to follow up on that, you mentioned the Donut Empire and Fabuland, the amusement park that Ivy's father owns where she works, which, on the surface is sort of a fun, cheery, sugary place, but there's a lot that lies beneath that. So can you sort of talk about the facade of using that as a setting, and how it's actually really sort of representative of the truths that lie underneath the appearances?
Sure. I mean, the amusement park, I've always had kind of a love-hate relationship with amusement parks and fairs, probably more hate than love, but everything is so sparkly, and everything's delicious, and it's so much fun. But from a very young age, I found them to be kind of a dark place. When you really look closer, it's a little bit dirty. I remember right before going to an amusement park when I was about 12, I had one of my mother's women's magazines, and it had an article about accidents on amusement park rides. For some reason, I read that right before. So whenever my friends were urging me to go on a ride, I kept thinking of it falling apart, or part of it flying out of the sky and people getting injured. I don't know, some of the safety regulations on some of that stuff I have my doubts about. So anyway, from a very young age, it would be I go to try to have fun, but it would seem like a dark place. The stuff people are eating is not really good for them, or not to be like a killjoy or anything, but there's just something about it that bothers me at the same time that I'm trying to have a good time at an amusement park. So it seems like there's a lot of combined with the fun of a really scary ride is just the fear, and why do we combine those two together? Why do we find that fun? These are just the questions I have at amusement parks. But so it felt like a good setting to explore, and I wanted it to have a certain honky-tonk quality for Mr. Cork, Ivy's father, and I just added donuts to that. I did want to say that one of the initial inspirations when I was just sort of exploring, like, how do I want to explore these characters, or there's a book in the, or a scene in the very beginning of the book where Ivy and her dad accidentally serve a deep fried rubber glove, because the rubber glove fell into the hot oil. And that was one of the first scenes I wrote in the book, because I had a friend who that actually happened to her at a restaurant.
That's unfortunate.
And I just loved that story so much, of like how she was poking at her her onion rings, and she discovered that there was like this hand
Yeah,
in
you
it.
don't.
But I was like, can I use that? Can I have that? And she said, yes, please do. So that I started with that, like a father and a daughter and a deep fried rubber glove, and the story just grew from there. I know that's a really weird story, but that was the beginning of that book. So
That's some really good behind the scenes scoops.
yeah. And I promised never to tell what restaurant she was at. It's still open.
Oh, that'll be the after interview. The interview after the interview.
Maybe if they ever close, I'll share that. But
There you go. You can divulge it then. We'll revisit you.
It's in Western Massachusetts. I will say that.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, that narrows it down.
It does. Be with my magnifying glass later. But one, I have to say, I agree with you about the whole allure of the amusement park. I loved them and was terrified of them as a child. And my parents always used to tell me that I was the biggest waste of money because I wouldn't go on anything. So, they would pay for parking and I would eat my way through the park. But other than that, that was pretty much it. So it wasn't really an investment on their money. And the scene that you were particularly talking about is great because, not only did it inspire the book, but when you read it in the story itself, it really gives you an insight into the dynamic between Ivy and her father, and how she is the one who always sort of has, public relations in mind, where he's just sort of a disaster walking.
Right.
But it's just interesting that, that scrap of something turns into a very revelatory scene. But I wanted to ask you too, it's a young adult book, so mostly teenagers. So how do you really tap into that teen zeitgeist, and in what ways are you able to, call on the emotional truth of your own, adolescence or high school years to come up with something that's authentic, or that has, that touch of realism?
Yeah, I mean, I find looking back at my own high school years, like, it never ends. Like, you can always find more to write about that. I don't know if that's just me, and I think a lot of people who write young adult feel that way. But transitioning from adult to young adult was not that difficult for me. I have to say, a lot of people did point out that a lot of my adult characters were rather adolescent in their attitude toward life. And I had a lot of people saying, why don't you try young adult? Because it's like a lot of my adult characters aren't fully adults. That's just the sort of people I write about. They try, but they often come back to various adolescent issues, as a lot of people do. So yeah, I mean, I feel like for me, age 15 through 17 is extremely vivid. Like, when I go up on Facebook and I see friends or classmates from that era, it's like I feel very comfortable. Like, I feel like I could just jump into this sort of conversation we always had. And I don't know why that is. I think there are just people who are like that and keep coming back to that. And it was because I kept coming back to that in adult fiction that I decided to occasionally give it its own space and do young adult, in the hopes that my adult books perhaps could start to become a little more mature and adult. We'll see. I've written 2 YAs now, and I'm in the middle of another. So, but I also have still some adult ideas brewing. So I'm hoping to get back to that next after the one in progress is done.
Sure. Excellent. So that lends itself really nicely to my next question. But, having written both young adult and adult, and I think you actually had written or published, I want to say, about 5 adult novels before you published your first young adult novel. So can you talk a little bit about the difference in writing for that younger audience and how it might help then in pacing an adult novel? Did you see a difference?
Yeah, I mean, probably went about it the first time I went about it the same way, but discovered you can't do that. Like, I tend to meander. And with young adult, I think there is this expectation that the plot will move each chapter. I mean, there's that expectation in adult too, but that the payoffs will come a little bit quicker. You just have to focus on your plot and your pace a little tighter. So that has helped me to be more disciplined about that. Certainly with the young adult books. And I do hope that, again, that'll kind of apply to the adult books when I go back to it. But, and I think there are also, as much as young adult is much broader now and you can get away with almost anything people say, I still think there are certain rules with young adult that don't apply to adult. Even if you, in terms of the material, sex and drugs or whatever, you really could write about almost anything you want in young adult in a way you couldn't 20 years ago. I still think there are just certain emotional rules you do have to end at a slight bit of positivity, even if it's not a very positive book. That's not really true for adult. You can be as dark as you want, even at the end. And I think there are just, your character's behavior, especially your main character, you do kind of have to pay attention a little more. I can have an adult narrator who just makes huge mistakes and puts herself into danger. And like, because you're writing for a younger audience, you just have to think a little bit about like your character's behavior and what does that say about what is acceptable or safe for a person. Like if a person does something pretty bad, there has to be a consequence in a way that maybe doesn't apply so much to adult, if that makes sense. If you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I could give an example from All the Pretty Things, but it's kind of, in a way, not terribly interesting. Like, you just, if your narrator, you have to be careful what your narrator says and does and make sure there are consequences if it's, pretty risky behavior.
Sure.
Because your audience is maybe looking at it in a different way, a 13 or 14-year-old as opposed to an adult who's just entertaining themselves. So yeah.
And I'm assuming being a parent might play a role in that as well. I bet you think a little bit differently after you have a child of your own. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want her to ever read my books, my daughter. So there's that. She knows that The Leaf Reader, my first young adult book, is for slightly younger people. So she has sort of grabbed onto that and is like, when do I get to read The Leaf Reader? And that has enough stuff in it that, I mean, she's 8. I'm like, never? I don't know. But I think it'd be okay when she's 13. That would be okay. But yeah, I mean, I certainly think about her eventual adolescent experience and what I would and wouldn't want her reading. And I have to say the YA that I write is a little bit older YA. Like not so much a 12-year-old reading, but more 15, 16. Yeah.
And to come back to well, actually, I guess this could sort of apply to your adult books or your young adult books, but the industry is really, really big on categorization and classification, and a lot of times you get called quirky or you write mysteries that are literary, and I think that can be both a help and a hindrance, both for the writer and for the reader, because of course they need somewhere to put you on a shelf, but that might also create sort of a false impression for the reader. So I'm just wondering, what do you think about the way books are categorized, and also how do you think of your books? What do you think about them?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the quirky category, because that is wonderful and I love being called that. I think it's true, but it does kind of put you a little bit outside the mainstream thriller mystery category, where you're kind of an outlier, and people who read the mainstream thrillers might not see your book or give you a chance, or say quirky, does that mean, or literary, does that mean it's slow, or I'm going to have to learn something? I don't know. I think there's just different associations with the category literary. I mean, it's hard because my books, they have a mystery to them, but they're generally shelved in general fiction, which I think is fair. But it's interesting. I wonder who makes that call. I think that's the right call for me, but I bet there are authors who would prefer to be categorized as mystery as opposed to general fiction. And it's a very fine line with writers like me who are kind of doing a little, or some of my books are a little bit more mystery than others. So it's hard to, like, maybe does this one go in the mystery category, but this is general fiction. It's hard. it's hard, and I think it's hard probably for the booksellers to make the call sometimes too. But yeah, I haven't really found what my exact place is yet. But in YA, it's easier because it's all categorized as YA, and YA suspense. That seems like a fair label for what I've been doing for the past couple books. So.
Sure. Well, just to put out a disclaimer, your books are far from boring. I have never found that to be the case. I remember the first book of yours that I read, which I think was your second book. It was In Search of the Rose Notes,
Oh, yeah.
which was way back, I don't know, either 2009 or 2011. I'm not sure, but
2011 is when it came out.
okay, so yeah, so I've known you since then, but I can honestly tell you that since reading that book, I've read everything that you've published since, and they've all been great. But I do want to ask you, where you got your ideas from, because a lot of your books seem to spark from a very specific inspiration. Like I know for In Search of the Rose Notes, there were those time life, sort of the supernatural books, but you've also looked at, women in country music, historical figures, like Marie Campbell. I don't know. I think I might have said her name.
Oh yeah, right.
But can you
I
just
forgot about that one, but
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they usually actually come from an emotional place. Actually, like there's some emotional experience that you might be able to not be able to identify it once the book is done. Like I just wanted to explore. Like In Search of the Rose Notes was my first book where it was very kind of like looking back at adolescence, and the original idea was just a young woman, in her late 20s who just cannot get over something that happened when she was 13 or 14, and I just, it's like it sort of weighs down on her all the time, and I just started with that character and then added the time life, the element of the time life books. I mean, someone told me recently that she thought of my books as young women facing like absurd psychological situations, and I thought, yeah, that often is the case. I never had that aim, but like my book The Evening Spider is about kind of the postpartum experience and how many weird things can happen to you psychologically with that. And the current book, All the Pretty Things, is again about a young woman in kind of a weird psychological situation of having this father she has to deal with who just is kind of makes absurd demands on her. And looking back on my books, I would say at least half of them have that element of just young women in strange psychological situations.
Sure.
That are intriguing to me. And often, like with the country music thing, that there's often just something that I've always wanted to research that is shoehorned into the book in some way. So the ideas come from different places, I think. Sometimes I try to put too many things in a book and then have to go back and shovel some things out. Like that book about country music, women in country music, it had a whole additional theme in the first draft that just didn't really fit with women in country music, and it was like I was trying to do too many things at once, so I had to kind of do a full revision of that book at a kind of a late stage, to try not to have too many things going on at once. I do have that difficulty of deciding which things belong in which book and which should be saved for another book, and that often means a lot of revision later.
Yeah, I was going to say there'll always be an editor to tell you no, but I think it's actually probably better to have more that you can take out versus hearing, well, this is great, but you need to add 100 pages before we can publish it.
Right.
So let me ask you this then. I don't know, a couple of years ago, you told me that you think of your work as dialogue being at its heart. So can you talk about that concept, and also how sort of there's internal dialogue within a book, but it also creates a dialogue with the reader. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I love writing dialogue to a point where it becomes a problem. Like first drafts have huge amounts of dialogue and very little of anything else, and then I have to go back and flesh it out more. I think when I started, even at a very young age, writing, I loved writing dialogue. I was just very interested in the flow of a conversation and what happens between people as a conversation goes along, and how the things they hide from each other, or the things they suddenly feel comfortable revealing. And something that really inspired me with that was reading the Japanese writer Murakami. His work is, nothing like what I write, but I found when I first read him, I just was inspired by the way he wrote dialogue. It was kind of absurd and quirky, but it felt vaguely real at the same time, and the way, just the things that opened up between people. It was just very surprised. I had never read dialogue like that before, and it was very exciting to do. And I felt it like it gave me permission to try some things on my own with dialogue. And as I said, what I write is nothing. It might sound weird because what I write is nothing like what he writes, but it just opened up something in me in exploring what I could do with dialogue between characters. And I mean, I find it's the easiest thing to write. I think a lot of writers feel that way. Not all, but it's just once you have two characters pretty well, or three, the dialogue can flow pretty naturally, and it can become sort of a lazy thing that you're just writing this dialogue and you need to stop and like ask yourself what it's all about and how you're going to frame this. Is everything that these people say important? Probably not. At a certain point, you're just kind of like enjoying the conversation, but it's not moving the plot anywhere. So there's some of the pitfalls of being a dialogue heavy writer.
Sure. Now I would say I think dialogue can, absolutely make or break a book. And I think, particularly in writing young adult fiction, if you're writing for a younger audience and they're reading their book and somehow they think that you don't, speak like they do or have the same concerns that they do. And that's probably, even though I'm far from a young adult now, and I think about it sometimes and I'm like, how am I so far from that? Because I still read a lot of young adult fiction or a lot of adult books that have teen characters. And one of my biggest pet peeves, and I won't, name names, but is when dialogue rings false. And I think it's especially apparent, when it's a younger person, that can completely, ruin a book or your believability of it. So, having said that, I can say that I read all the pretty things and there was no problems like that for me. Not that I can say that I have my finger on the pulse of, the youth these days. I don't know if that's true, but there's certainly nothing that rang false. But I think it's very easy when you're older to sort of take that for granted and not really put in the work to understand, how people are talking or what they're talking about. So that was just a little digression on my part. And for that, I apologize.
No, that's a good point. That like with YA particularly, the dialogue does need to. I mean, it does for everyone, but and that can be a question you ask yourself when you're writing young adult. To what extent do you just write dialogue that seems natural to you? To what extent do you ask yourself, like, do kids say that kind of thing anymore? And then it can become very self-conscious. Like at one point I was asking my niece to read what I wrote, and I had pot or weed in the book, and one of them she told me nobody says anymore, and I can't remember which one it was, but like it can become a little overly overwrought if you try to sound like the young kids, and just try to sound natural. I mean, that's how I approach it, rather than trying to go to the local high school and put my ear in and just hope to some extent there's a certain universality to authentic dialogue.
Sure. All right. So I think maybe two more questions, and then if you have anything that you would like to add. But I did want to ask you, obviously, we mentioned at the beginning that, times are strange. All of our circumstances have changed. So what is that like for you as a writer? Now you have your 8-year-old daughter who's home all the time. So I would imagine that makes it much more difficult to find pockets of quiet time to be productive. So how are you sort of adjusting your writing life given the circumstances?
I wish I had good advice for writers in the same situation as me. It's been kind of difficult. The first few weeks, I was really just focused on not freaking out and homeschooling my daughter, which those two together are like an interesting challenge. And I've just in the past few weeks started to write again. So, I mean, I guess I would say, for me, it's been to just start small and not be too ambitious about it. Just find an hour here or there, even if you're in a home with lots of people and lots of noise. Just find a way to carve that out for yourself, whether it's after bedtime or early in the morning, just so you stay in practice. That's all I can say, because that's all I've done. I've not returned yet to like writing for several hours a day. But I hope to get there, you know. I mean, a lot of people are in a situation where there isn't going to be, I mean, if you're in a situation with children, there's not going to be school for some time. So I would say just do the best you can and be kind to yourself, and find an hour here or there where you can have a cup of tea and with a notebook, and do the best you can. I wish I had better advice than that, but that's all I've been able to do
No, I
personally.
think that's very real, and everybody's just trying to adjust, and you really sort of have to go with what the day brings you. Um, so I think that that's good advice, to just be able to say, you know, you have to go with what works when it works, and if it doesn't work, try again the next day. Um, but I
Yeah,
guess
if you find a project that that gives you some calming, yeah, I don't know, if, you know, find the project that feels like a good escape for you. You know, it might take a few tries. Or I mean, you might not be able to work on what you were working on 2 months ago. Some
sure.
people might, you know, but I would say maybe accept that you're not in the same place you were a few months ago, and it's okay to put that aside if there's some other project that feels better for you right now. Like right now, I recently wrote a chapter book for kids that's like much cleaner and happier than anything else I've written. It was just like a year ago, and I was thinking like maybe I'd just write a sequel to that. It might never be published because we haven't found a publisher yet for the first one, but it still might, you know, maybe that's the emotional place I'm in right now, to just write about a cat, which is what it was about. So
Sure, nothing wrong
yeah.
with that. But yeah, it's funny. I've been talking to a lot of people, and there are a lot of people saying, you know, they're either far more productive than they were before this happened, or far less productive, and they're either finding it much easier to read and fall into that escapism trap, or they can't really read fiction at all. So I think really the common theme is, you know, you have to not pressure yourself to do one or the other. You just have to find what works for you in the moment. And so, of course, my natural sort of final question to you is going to be, what might readers expect next, or are you not able to divulge that yet?
I can, what I've been working on all year, and then I'm actually waiting for revision notes on something. So I'm hoping my productivity will return when I get those. But I was working on another young adult book. We think it's going to be called When All the Girls Are Sleeping, and it's about a boarding school. Well, it's an all-girls side of a boarding school that sort of has two locations, but where one of the senior dormitory is thought to be haunted. And there was a death in the senior dormitory the previous year, and the narrator is exploring whether or not it's haunted, and the history and her own psychology in that situation. And it was inspired by, I went to Mount Holyoke College, which is an all-women's college in Western Massachusetts, and there was one particular dormitory called Wilder Hall that everybody thought was haunted, and there were a lot of stories around it. Some conflicting stories, and I just kind of based it very, very loosely on that and people's attitude towards that dormitory, and some things that could have been going on psychologically with the groups of young women who stayed there. So that's what it is. But it is YA. I thought the dormitory situation would be better for YA than to try to make it college. So
That sounds nice and creepy, and I'm sure there's some
yeah.
secrets, you know, thrown in for good measure.
Right.
It wouldn't be a book of yours without secrets. And I almost forgot, but I said really quickly that I would come back to the cover of All the Pretty Things, which is out now. And it's really a cool cover. And the thing I appreciated about this cover is you can actually relate it to a scene in the book, which a lot of times, you know, you might not be able to equate it to anything. But so what are I'll ask you that. What are your thoughts on covers and how they convey books? And do you have any specific thoughts on this cover for your newest?
I love the cover. I mean, whenever I get a cover, almost always, it's my favorite. Like, but this one particularly, it really, I was certain they put a Ferris wheel on the cover, and then when they didn't, I thought, oh, this is so perfect. I really love it. It's just creepy enough. It's just colorful enough. I love the neon that they did with all the pretty things, because I think that kind of it helps with the sort of uh, the amusement park theme, and how it's a little bit like flashing light in the darkness. It kind of looks pretty, but there's something about neon that's also a little bit can be a little, what's the word? It often can be, a blinking something trashy, like a XX sort of thing. So I liked that they did the neon. Yeah, I think it really actually is one of my favorite covers, and I think it's just the right mood, and it's good for a crossover. It kind of looks like a crossover novel a little bit, like it. And you could see an adult picking it up and trying it out, which was I had kind of written it hoping it wouldn't just appeal to teenagers, that there would be things about Ivy's psychological experience that would speak to adults as well. So
Sure. Yeah. No, it was really catchy, and I love that someone was obviously, paying attention, because there is just a quick scene where Ivy's, running throughout the amusement park, and she takes a look at the carousel, and then she notices sort of for the first time that the horses, their faces really are, if you look up close, they're a little bit scary. They're not just sort of the sweet, innocent thing that you've come to equate with the carousel. And I think that really ties in sort of with the entire theme of the book. Kudos to the designer. But anyway, let me just thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I know you have a lot of things to occupy your time, but I appreciate you sitting down and doing this interview with me. And before we say goodbye, I'm just wondering, is there anything, that you would like to say, any topic that we haven't covered? I'm just going to turn it over to you quickly.
No, just thank you for having me. I've been enjoying the show. I watched your first couple of episodes, and thanks for thinking of me, and I'll be watching future episodes. I'm excited to see who else you'll be talking to.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. There's the mystery of the day. Who will I be talking to? Whoever will agree. So thank you so much, Emily. And again, the new book is All the Pretty Things. And you stay safe, keep writing, and we will look forward to what we see next from you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Emily. Take care.
You too.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.